Hey everyone, Cody Hayes here, and I'd like to welcome you to this lecture where we are going to look at more of the disputed writings of Paul. In this case, we're going to look at the pastorals. The word pastor, it's a Greek word that means shepherd, but the letters to Timothy and Titus. That would be 1st and 2nd Timothy and then Titus. And of course, writing in the wake of the apostle, that is Paul dead and somebody pretending to be him? So look a little bit here with the date, the author, and the critique. If Paul is the author of the Pastorals, then the letters would have been written during the years of 63 to 67 CE when Paul was in Rome. Essentially in the period right before his death in Rome. But if Paul is not the author, then the letters were written during the late 1st century to the early 2nd century CE/AD. And two of the issues regarding Paul's authorship of the pastorals has to do with the early church structure/hierarchy and the role of women, and that will be the focus for this particular lecture. Okay, so let's start off first with the early church structure/hierarchy in the pastorals. The pastorals, they mention 3 church offices which take place by the laying on of hands, and this is also found in the book of Acts. The laying on of hands refers to the sacrament or the ritual of ordination. And arguably this goes back to Jesus, even though we don't have a specific example in the canonical gospels. I think, of course, um, during the Gospel of John, where the resurrected Christ breathes on his apostles and, of course, says, receive the Holy Spirit, referencing the sacrament of reconciliation. It's possible that Jesus could have ordained them in a different manner, but more than likely he did probably lay his hands on them. And, even if he didn't, then arguably the ritual would have its origins with the apostles, because we definitely have the documented evidence of that. But there are 3 of these church offices. What are they? Well, the first one is the bishop. Then the second is presbyter/elder. And then the third is deacon. So what I want to do here is I want to read from one of the letters of Ignatius of Antioch, who comes out of the Johannine community, and this is his letter to the Samaritans. This would have been on his way to martyrdom in Rome, so the dates for the letter are around 107 to 110 CE/AD, so very, very early in church history, early 2nd century. You must all follow the bishop as Jesus Christ follows the Father, and the presbytery as you would the apostles. Reverence the deacons as you would the command of God. Let no one do anything of concern to the church without the bishop. Let that be considered a valid Eucharist which is celebrated by the bishop or by one whom he appoints. Wherever the bishop appears, let the people be there, just as wherever Jesus Christ is, there is the Catholic Church. Nor is it permitted without the bishop either to baptize or to celebrate the agape. That would be the Eucharist. But whatever he approved, this too is pleasing to God, so that whatever is done will be secure and valid. Okay. Well, let me go into a little more detail with these particular offices. I've got there, Greek transliterated and then the English equivalent. Let me have a sip of water here real quick. But you have starting off episcopal or episcopus, and in English we refer to this office as bishop or overseer. And the bishop, he is considered to be a successor of the apostles. So the authority that the apostles had, he now has. And he's in charge of a particular area, which would later be called a diocese, or see for short. The word refers to administration. His main jobs are to celebrate the sacraments, the big one being the Eucharist, the Holy Communion, maintain orthodoxy, that would be right teaching, and to train those who are beneath him. So the bishop, he's the boss. And to those of you that belong to a church tradition that maintains this traditional structure, when it comes to issues relating to church corruption, almost always the bishop is the focus because he's the individual in charge, he's the boss. Well, then next, you have the presbyter or presbyteroi, and in English, we refer to this office as priest or elder. The English word for priest, it derives out of the Greek word presbyter, but it literally means elder or old man. But in any case, the presbyter slash priest, he serves as the bishop's assistant in celebrating the sacraments. So when the bishop cannot celebrate the sacraments, that job falls on the presbyter or priest. And of course, the big one would be the Eucharist, the Holy Communion. Of the traditional seven, the only sacrament that the presbyter slash priest cannot celebrate is the sacrament of holy orders. Only the bishop can celebrate that sacrament because he is recognized as having full priesthood, and of course, he's um, recognized as a successor to the apostles. And then next, you have the deaconate. And in English, we refer to this office as the deacon. The deacon, he acts as a servant to the community. The word deacon refers to servant. He assists widows, he helps the poor, etc. A deacon, he can celebrate the liturgy, the public ministry, but not with the exception of baptism, the sacraments. So the deacon, he can celebrate the liturgy, he can preach, he can celebrate the sacrament of baptism, but that's the only sacrament he's allowed to celebrate. Um, he can celebrate the funeral liturgy. Of course, that refers to liturgy. On the Catholic side, he can marry a couple. On the Orthodox side, he cannot. And that's because they have a different understanding of how marriage is a sacrament. But even though the deacon is at the bottom of the ordained clergy, the ordained priesthood, a lot of deacons in history have had significant amount of power because often at times the bishop, who is the boss, will keep a deacon around him as kind of almost like a secretary. And so those deacons had significant amount of power. I remember when I was in college and a paper that I was working on, it was a paper on purgatory. But one of the sources that I used was some of the sermons of Gregory the Great, the Bishop of Rome, from back in the 6th century, if memory serves me correct. I may be off a century there. I'm not sure. It may have been 4th century, but somewhere around there. And I remember he had this deacon named Peter. He had a deacon named Peter. Another thing to mention with that is with the deacons, the early members of the College of Cardinals were the deacons in Rome. But then after that, you have what's called the royal priesthood or the lay priesthood, or all baptized Christians. That essentially anyone who's baptized is a priest. And one of the arguments that's made um, in the letter to the Hebrews is that their priesthood is superior to the Jewish because they're a priest in the order of Melchizedek, which is Jesus's priesthood. But moving forward, a criticism regarding Paul's authorship of the pastorals is that the early church structure slash hierarchy was at least a generation after his death. Let me have a quick another sip of water and I'll focus on that. So essentially, at least a generation, 20 years after his death. Well, let's look here at what we find in the undisputed letters. In the letter to the Philippians, one of the undisputed letters of Paul, he does mention bishops. Likewise, also in the letter to the Philippians and in the letter to the Romans, Paul mentions deacons. Presbyters slash elders are missing from Paul's undisputed letters, but in the book of Acts, Paul has encounters with presbyters slash elders and he ordains some of them. While there are issues with the book of Acts in terms of theology, I don't completely think all of the history within the book of Acts is wrong. So I would say that Paul, did have encounters with presbyters slash elders and did actually ordain some to that office. But to add to that a little bit further, in the Gospel of Mark, which was written less than a decade after Paul's death, some will even argue before Paul's death, mentions disciples that were not part of Jesus's inner circle, and these disciples could have consisted of members of the lower clergy, such as the presbyters or the deacons. And I'll add to that, there are some historians, I'm not quite among them in this case, but will argue that Jesus having this inner circle of the 12, and then, these disciples that are not part of the inner circle but are outside, that this reflected more of the church at this time of the writing of the gospel and not Jesus's actual ministry. That essentially you had the 12, the apostles, who are Jesus's inner circle, but then like you have these kind of lower members of the clergy, disciples outside of that, but it reflects more of the church at that time. But if you want to make that argument, then that would show that the early church structure slash hierarchy was something that Paul would have known. And that's my judgment on this particular point. I do argue that the early church structure slash hierarchy is something that Paul would have known. Well, we're going to stop here, and then when we come back, we will look at another one of the issues that's brought into question with Paul's authorship of the pastorals, and that is the issue regarding women. So take care. I will symbolically see you then.